Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the golden age of ancient Greece, where gods still walk among mortals and craftsmen shape wonders beyond imagination. Forget the simple morality tales you might remember. This is the story of genius and its shadow, of a father and son, of wings built from desperation and dreams. You might think you know how it ends, but there's so much more to discover in the choices that led there, the grief that followed, and the reasons these stories have haunted us for millennia. If you're enjoying these journeys into the past, a quick like or subscribe means the world. I love hearing where you're listening from, so drop a comment with your location and the time there. Let's see how far our little community stretches. Now make yourself comfortable, lying down or sitting. Close your eyes and simply enjoy. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the Golden Age, when gods still walked among mortals and the sea whispered secrets to those who listened, there lived a craftsman whose hands could shape wonders beyond imagination. His name was Daedalus, a name that meant cunningly wrought. And he dwelt in the great city of Athens, beneath the shadow of the sacred Acropolis where Athena's olive trees rustled in the Mediterranean breeze. Athens in those distant days was not yet the city of philosophers and marble temples you might imagine. It was younger then, still finding its shape, still learning what it meant to be the jewel of the Aegean. But even in that early time, the city recognized greatness when it dwelt within its walls, and Daedalus was greatness itself, walking through the narrow streets with sawdust on his hands and dreams lighting his eyes. The goddess Athena herself had blessed him, Athena of the bright eyes, who sprang fully formed from Zeus's head, goddess of wisdom and craft, patron of all who worked with their hands to bring beauty and utility into the world. In Daedalus's workshop near the Agora, marvels took shape beneath his careful fingers. He carved statues so lifelike they seemed to breathe, their marble chests rising and falling with invisible breath. He designed mechanisms that moved as if alive, wheels turning within wheels, bronze gears clicking with mathematical precision. His designs were so intricate, they appeared woven by divine fingers, each line and curve serving both beauty and purpose. People came from distant islands to commission his work, to watch him bend over his workbench as afternoon light slanted through the windows, illuminating the fine dust that danced in the air. Merchants sought his counsel on ship designs that would ride the waves more smoothly. Priests asked him to craft vessels for their temples, containers for sacred oils and honey, boxes for keeping precious scrolls safe from moisture and time. Women requested jewelry so delicate it seemed spun from spider silk and moonlight, and Daedalus fulfilled every request with the same quiet intensity, his mind always working, always seeing how things might be improved, refined, perfected. But genius, as the ancient stories teach us, often walks hand in hand with darkness. For all his gifts, Daedalus possessed the same flaws that thread through mortal hearts: pride in his accomplishments, fear of being surpassed, the cold shadow that envy casts when we measure ourselves against others and find the comparison painful. It was in this spirit that Daedalus took his young nephew Talos as an apprentice. The boy came to him bright-eyed and eager, perhaps 12 summers old, with quick hands and a quicker mind. He was the son of Daedalus's sister Perdix, And in his face, Daedalus could see the family resemblance, the same intense focus, the same hunger to understand how things worked. At first, the craftsman felt pride in teaching the boy, watching him learn to plane wood until it was smooth as water, to join pieces so cunningly that no seam showed, to look at a problem from angles others never considered. The boy learned with frightening speed what took other apprentices months to grasp. Talos understood in days. His hands, though small, worked with sureness beyond his years. And more than this, more troubling than this, the boy began to innovate, to see solutions Daedalus himself had not imagined. One afternoon, as master and apprentice walked along the shore where Athens meets the sea, they came upon a fish that had washed up on the sand. It was dead, its silver scales dulling in the sun. But young Talos knelt beside it, with wonder in his eyes. He touched the fish's spine with one careful finger, feeling the jagged ridge of bones that ran along its back, each vertebra sharp and angled. "Uncle," the boy said, not looking up from his examination, "do you see how each bone overlaps the next? How they're like little teeth all in a row?" Daedalus nodded, watching the boy with an expression that was becoming harder to read. Talos picked up a piece of driftwood, worn smooth by waves, and then found a sharp stone. There on the beach, with the gulls crying overhead and the waves whispering against the sand, the boy began to work. He scored the edge of the wood with the stone, making notches at regular intervals, copying the pattern of the fish's spine. Then he found a piece of harder wood that had washed ashore from some shipwreck, and he began to saw through it with his notched tool. The teeth bit into the wood as no tool had done before. Where Daedalus's smoothest blades required patient back-and-forth motion and still sometimes slipped, Talos's new tool cut with brutal efficiency, the notches gripping the wood and tearing through it in a way that was both crude and brilliant. "I'll make it better," Talos said, his voice filled with the unconscious certainty of youth. "I'll make the teeth from bronze and space them more carefully, and—" But he fell silent when he looked up and saw his uncle's face. Daedalus stood very still, looking down at the boy and his invention. The afternoon sun was behind the craftsman, casting his face in shadow, and what Talos saw there, or thought he saw, made the boy's words dry up like water spilled on hot stone. "It's very clever," Daedalus said at last, and his voice was soft, almost gentle, but something had changed in that moment, something that could not be called back or unmade. A shadow had fallen across the master craftsman's heart, the cold shadow of envy, bitter as wormwood, sharp as the teeth on the boy's new tool. In the days that followed, Daedalus watched his nephew with new eyes. Every innovation Talos made, and the boy made many, his mind bubbling over with ideas, felt like a reproach to the master's own achievements. When Talos invented a potter's wheel that spun more smoothly than any before, Daedalus praised him, but the praise stuck in his throat. When the boy designed a compass for drawing perfect circles, improving on the master's own design, Daedalus felt something twist inside his chest. The citizens of Athens began to speak of young Talos with wonder. "The nephew will surpass the uncle," they said, meaning it as praise for both, not understanding how such words could wound. "What marvels he'll create when he's grown." The boy was too young to feel pride in their words, too innocent to see his uncle's tightening jaw, the way Daedalus's hands clenched when people spoke of Talos's promise. It came to a head one evening, as the summer sun descended toward the wine-dark sea, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. Daedalus and Talos had been working all day on a commission for the Temple of Athena, a great bronze door that would require both their skills to complete. They climbed together to the heights of the Acropolis, as they often did at day's end, to watch the sunset and let the evening breeze cool their sweat-dampened skin. From that great height, Athens spread below them like a map, the houses tiny as toys, the streets narrow ribbons winding between them. The Temple of Athena rose behind them, its stones still new and bright, not yet weathered by centuries. To the west, the sun touched the horizon, and the sea caught its light like hammered bronze. To the east, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "Uncle," Talos said, standing at the very edge of the cliff, his toes touching the brink, "I've been thinking about ships. What if we designed a keel that—" He never finished his sentence. What happened next occurred in a single heartbeat, in the space between one breath and another. Perhaps Daedalus meant only to grab the boy, to pull him back from the edge. The cliff was steep, the drop deadly. Perhaps he meant only to give him a fright, to teach him caution about standing so close to danger. Or perhaps in that moment, the darkness that had been growing in his heart finally burst free, and he acted without thinking, without meaning to, without understanding what his hands were doing, until it was done. He pushed. Talos's eyes widened in surprise more than fear, surprise that his uncle, his teacher, his family would do such a thing. The boy's arms windmilled as he teetered on the edge, and then he was falling, his scream cut short by the rush of wind, his small body tumbling through the air like a leaf torn from a tree. But the goddess Athena, who sees all that occurs beneath the sun, could not allow such treachery to go unanswered. She who had blessed Daedalus with skill had also blessed young Talos with his quick mind and clever hands. The boy was under her protection, innocent of any wrong, guilty of nothing but being talented and young. As Talos fell, the goddess transformed him. His body changed midair, bones hollowing, arms spreading into wings, skin sprouting feathers mottled brown and gray. Where a boy had fallen, a partridge flew, or tried to fly. The transformation saved his life, but could not erase his terror. The partridge that had been Talos beat its wings frantically, but it could not bring itself to soar high. It flew low, hugging the ground, landing in the scrub at the cliff's base, its heart hammering with the memory of falling. From that day forward, all partridges would fly close to the earth, nesting in low bushes rather than high trees, remembering in their blood and bones the terror of that first fall. And if you listen carefully on a quiet evening near the cliffs of Athens, you might still hear a partridge calling, a sound like laughter, or like weeping, or like both at once. Daedalus stood at the cliff's edge, his hands still extended, staring down at where his nephew had vanished. The horror of what he had done crashed over him like a wave, cold and suffocating. He fell to his knees, his craftsman's hands, those same hands that had shaped such beauty, trembling before him. What had he done? What monster had he become? But the moment of remorse passed too quickly, replaced by self-preservation's cold clarity. People had seen them climb the Acropolis together. People would ask questions. The boy's mother, his own sister, would demand answers. and the Areopagus, the ancient court of Athens that judged crimes of murder, would show no mercy to one who had killed his own kin, regardless of his reputation or his gifts. Daedalus told them it was an accident. He performed grief convincingly, and perhaps part of it was real, for we can regret our actions even as we seek to escape their consequences. He claimed Talos had leaned too far over the edge, seeking to see something far below, and had lost his balance. He wept as he told the story, and his tears were genuine, born of horror at himself as much as sorrow for the boy. But Athena had witnessed the truth, and the gods, though they might not always intervene in mortal affairs, do not permit such crimes to be hidden behind lies. Word reached the Areopagus court, perhaps whispered by a priest who had prayed for guidance, perhaps through dreams sent to the judges, perhaps simply through the grinding wheels of mortal investigation. The truth, like oil on water, rose to the surface. The judges of the Areopagus, stern men who sat in judgment on the hill of Ares, heard the evidence and pronounced their verdict. Daedalus was guilty of the murder of his nephew. The punishment for such a crime was death, or if death could be avoided, exile, permanent exile from Athens and all its territories, never to return, never to see again the city that had been his home, the workshop that had been his pride, the temples he had helped adorn. Daedalus chose exile, as men in his position usually did. Better to live far away than not to live at all. He gathered what tools he could carry, took what gold and silver he had saved, and fled under cover of darkness before the sentence could be carried out in more permanent fashion. He took ship on a merchant vessel headed east, away from Athens, away from Greece entirely, across the wine-dark sea toward distant lands. The ship carried him through waters both calm and storm-tossed, past islands where ancient gods had been born, past shores where heroes had fought and died. And finally, after weeks of sailing, the ship brought him to Crete, the great island that lay south of Greece, jewel of the Aegean, home to a civilization older and stranger than Athens, ruled by the powerful king Minos. Crete in those days was a wonder. Its cities were larger than those of Greece, its palaces more magnificent, its power greater. The Minoans, as they were called, had ruled the seas for generations, their navy unmatched, their trade routes stretching to Egypt and beyond. At the heart of this power sat King Minos in his palace at Knossos, a structure so vast and labyrinthine that visitors often lost their way in its corridors. Minos was the son of Zeus himself and the princess Europa, born of the god's desire and the woman's transformation into myth. He ruled with the authority of both mortal kingship and divine heritage, his word law across all the islands under Crete's influence. It was said he conversed with Zeus every 9 years, ascending to a sacred cave to receive wisdom and justice from his father. Whether this was true, or merely what kings claimed to maintain their power, no one dared question openly. Daedalus presented himself to Minos as a master craftsman seeking patronage, carefully saying nothing of why he had left Athens, nothing of the crime that shadowed his past. He brought drawings of his designs, small examples of his work, a mechanical bird that could flap its wings, a bronze mirror polished so smooth it reflected faces with perfect clarity, plans for buildings that would revolutionize how structures were made. Minos, who appreciated beauty and innovation as much as power, recognized genius when he saw it. Here was a craftsman who could build things the Cretans had never imagined, who could make the king's palace even more magnificent, who could create wonders that would cement Minos's reputation for all time. The king offered Daedalus sanctuary, a workshop, commissions that would keep him wealthy and busy, protection from those who might seek to bring him back to Athens for punishment. Daedalus accepted the king's offer with gratitude that was only partly feigned. Yes, he was exiled, but here was a fresh start, a chance to rebuild his reputation far from the scene of his crime. He threw himself into his work with renewed energy, designing improvements to the palace, creating fountains that used gravity to send water dancing into the air, crafting furniture inlaid with ivory and gold, making tools that the local craftsmen marveled at. The years passed. Daedalus found his place in the Cretan court, his shame receding into the past, though never quite forgotten, a constant ache, like an old wound that troubles the body when storms approach. He was respected, even admired, but he was also alone, cut off from his homeland, his family, his history. It was in this context that Daedalus met Naucrati. She was a slave in King Minos's household, not a servant captured in war, but one born into servitude, her parents having been slaves before her. Despite her status, there was something remarkable about Naucrati. She moved through the palace with quiet dignity, her eyes thoughtful, her manner gentle. She served the queen and her daughters, and sometimes she was assigned to tend the visiting craftsman, bringing him food as he worked late into the night, tidying his workspace when he was too absorbed in his projects to notice the mess accumulating around him. They spoke first of small things, the weather, the beauty of the flowers that grew in the palace gardens, the songs that the servants sang as they worked, then of larger things, the stories of their different homelands, the dreams they carried that might never be fulfilled, the compromises people make to survive in an imperfect world. Naucrati could not read, but she was wise in ways that had nothing to do with letters. She understood people, understood their hurts and hopes, and Daedalus, lonely and still haunted by what he had done to Talos, found in her presence a kind of peace. Their relationship deepened slowly, carefully, constrained by her status and his position, by the unspoken rules that governed such things in the palace. But love, when it comes, cares little for status or rules. They stole moments together in the quiet hours when the palace slept, meeting in the gardens where jasmine scented the night air, or in Daedalus's workshop where the smell of wood shavings and oil provided a different kind of comfort. And from their union came a child, a son, born as autumn turned to winter, when the first rains washed the dust from Crete's white stones. They named him Icarus, a name whose meaning has been lost to time, though some say it meant follower, for the boy would follow his father throughout his life, right to its tragic end. Icarus arrived in the world, screaming with vigorous life, his tiny fists waving, his face red with the outrage of birth. Daedalus held his son for the first time and felt something crack open in his chest. Love, fierce and protective, mingled with terror at how fragile the child seemed, how easily a small life could be extinguished. He thought of Talos, of course. He could not help but think of Talos, and he made a silent promise to this new child. I will be better. I will protect you. I will not let my darkness touch you. Naucrati nursed the baby and sang to him in the language of her people, songs that had been passed down through generations of slaves, songs of endurance and hope, and the small joys that make life bearable, even in bondage. She watched her son with eyes full of love and worry, knowing that the life of a slave's child was precarious, dependent on the whims of masters and the uncertain favor of gods. But because the child's father was Daedalus, valued by King Minos, little Icarus grew up with more freedom than most slave children. He played in the palace gardens, watched his father work in the great workshop, learned to walk on the smooth stone floors that had been cut and fitted with impossible precision by craftsmen long dead. The boy was bright-eyed and curious, quick to laugh, slow to cry. He asked endless questions about how things worked, why the sun moved across the sky, where birds went when they disappeared over the horizon. Daedalus taught his son what he could, showing him how to use tools safely, how to measure twice and cut once, how to see the pattern hidden inside a piece of wood waiting to be revealed. He was patient with Icarus in a way he had never been patient with Talos. Perhaps because Icarus was his son, perhaps because he was trying to atone for the past, perhaps simply because he was older now and had learned that genius without kindness is a cold and bitter thing. As Icarus grew from baby to child, Daedalus continued his work for King Minos. He designed new ships with improved hulls that cut through water more efficiently. He created irrigation systems that brought water to fields that had been dry. He built a great bronze giant, or so the stories say, that walked the shores of Crete, protecting it from invaders, though whether this was truth or myth, even the storytellers were unsure. But always, in the back of Daedalus's mind, there was the memory of Athens, of the cliff, of the moment when darkness had overtaken wisdom and he had destroyed what he should have nurtured. And sometimes at night, when he held his sleeping son, he would whisper apologies to the gods, to Talos, to the person he had once been before pride and envy had corrupted him. The boy Icarus knew nothing of this history, nothing of the crime that had brought his father to Crete. He knew only that his father was respected, that people came from distant lands to admire Daedalus's work, that when his father drew plans on parchment, magnificent structures eventually rose from those lines. Icarus grew up proud of his father, wanting nothing more than to be like him, to create beautiful things, to have people speak his name with admiration. The years turned like the wheel of the stars overhead. Icarus learned to swim in the sea, to climb the olive trees that grew on the hillsides, to run fast as the wind through the palace corridors when the servants weren't looking. He made friends with other children, sons and daughters of craftsmen and merchants, occasionally even the children of nobility who were curious about the inventor's son. His mother watched him grow with bittersweet pride, knowing her son would always be marked by her status as a slave, yet hoping he might transcend it through his father's influence and his own gifts. Daedalus watched his son grow and saw in him the same brightness he had seen in Talos, the quick mind, the clever hands, the hunger to understand. But where this similarity had once provoked envy, now it provoked only love and a fierce determination to protect. This child would not fall. This child would fly, not literally, not yet, for Daedalus had not yet dreamed of wings, but fly in the sense that matters, soaring to heights of achievement and happiness that his father's crimes had nearly made impossible. And so, The years passed in Crete, father and son together, building and learning and living in the shadow of King Minos's power, not yet knowing that the greatest and most terrible test was still to come, that the crimes of the past would reach forward into the present, that the craftsman's genius would both save them and doom them, and that one day, high above the wine-dark sea, Icarus would indeed fly, but in a way his father would forever regret having made possible. The years flowed by, like water through cupped hands, gentle and inexorable. Icarus grew from child to youth, beneath the Mediterranean sun, his skin bronzing, his limbs growing strong and lean. He learned the craft of his father with eager dedication, though he still preferred to spend his afternoons swimming in the sea or exploring the hills beyond the palace. He was perhaps 15 summers old when the darkness that would reshape all their lives began to unfold, though at first it seemed to have nothing to do with them at all. King Minos, in all his years of rule, had commanded respect through both wisdom and power. His navy protected trade routes, his laws brought order to the islands, his palace at Knossos stood as testament to Cretan superiority. But even kings, perhaps especially kings, are subject to the gods' whims and punishments, and Minos, in his pride, made a mistake that would echo through generations. It began with a prayer to Poseidon, the god who rules the seas with his trident, who shakes the earth when angered, who grants favor to sailors and drowns those who displease him. Minos, seeking to demonstrate his divine favor to all who might doubt his right to rule, prayed for a sign. "Send me a bull," he asked, magnificent beyond all others, white as sea foam, perfect in every way. "I will sacrifice it to you in gratitude, and all who see will know that the gods smile upon my reign." Poseidon, for reasons gods need not explain to mortals, granted the request. From the sea itself emerged a bull such as no one had ever seen, white as new snow, powerful as the waves, its horns gleaming like polished ivory, its eyes holding depths that seemed almost aware, almost knowing. It walked from the water as if the boundary between elements meant nothing to it, and it approached Minos with calm majesty. The king beheld the creature and was overcome, not with piety or gratitude, but with covetousness. The bull was too beautiful, too perfect to kill. Surely Poseidon would understand. Surely the god would not begrudge a king the desire to keep such a magnificent animal, to breed it with his herds, to create a line of cattle that would be the envy of all lands. Minos, in his mortal foolishness, decided to sacrifice a different bull, a fine specimen from his own herds, yes, but not the one the god had sent. This was hubris of the most dangerous kind, the arrogance that thinks it can bargain with the divine, that imagines gods will accept substitutes and deceptions. Poseidon's anger was immediate and terrible, but his vengeance was subtle in a way only gods can manage. He would not strike the king directly. Instead, he would strike at what Minos loved in a way that would bring shame beyond measure. Queen Pasiphae, a daughter of Helios, the sun god who sees all things, wife to Minos, mother to his children, was beautiful and proud, respected throughout the kingdom. She had borne the king fine sons and daughters, managed the palace with intelligence and grace, performed her rituals and duties with appropriate reverence. She deserved none of what befell her. But the god's justice often cares little for mortal concepts of fairness. Poseidon cursed her with an unnatural passion, a burning, consuming desire for the white bull, a hunger that gave her no peace, that drove all other thoughts from her mind. She wept at the wrongness of it, prayed to every god she could name for release. But the curse was ironclad, unbreakable. Day and night she was tormented by this impossible, shameful need. Finally, in desperation, Pasiphae sought out Daedalus. She came to his workshop late one evening, her face hidden by veils, her voice shaking as she explained, in words that must have cost her every shred of dignity to speak, what had been done to her and what she needed. "They say you can build anything," she whispered. "They say your mind can solve any problem, create any mechanism, make the impossible real. Help me. I know it's wrong. I know it's unnatural, but I cannot bear this torment any longer. If you have any mercy, help me." Daedalus faced a terrible choice in that moment. He could refuse, could claim that what she asked was too perverse, too unnatural to abet. But Pasiphae was his queen, daughter of a god, and her suffering was evident in every trembling word. Moreover, and perhaps this mattered most, she had the power to have him executed if he refused, or to make his life in Crete unbearable. He was still an exile, still dependent on the court's favor, still vulnerable, and so, with shame burning in his chest but his hands steady as ever, Daedalus set to work. He designed and built a hollow cow, life-sized and lifelike, crafted from wood and covered with real hide that he tanned and treated until it looked and felt genuine. The construction was masterful, the frame jointed in ways that allowed Pasiphae to climb inside and position herself within the false body, the exterior so cunningly crafted that from any distance it appeared to be a real animal. He brought it to a field where the white bull grazed, helped the queen enter her hiding place, and then withdrew, not wanting to witness what would follow. What happened in that field under the stars was an abomination born of a god's curse and a craftsman's terrible skill. Daedalus walked back to the palace with his head down, feeling the weight of another transgression added to those he already carried. He had helped bring something unnatural into the world, and he knew in his bones that the consequences would be dire. Months passed. The queen kept to her chambers, claiming illness, seeing no one but her most trusted servants. Rumors swirled through the palace, but no one knew the full truth. And then, in the depths of winter, Pasiphae gave birth in secret, attended only by midwives sworn to silence. The child, if it could be called a child, was a monster. It had the body of a man but the head of a bull, powerful and savage, with horns already sharp despite its newborn state. It emerged into the world bellowing with a voice that was neither fully human nor fully animal. And when it first opened its eyes, those eyes held nothing but hunger and rage. The midwives who attended the birth fled in terror. Even Pasiphae, looking upon what she had borne, could not find mother's love in her heart for this creature. They named it Asterion, though it would become known to history simply as the Minotaur, the bull of Minos. The creature grew with unnatural speed, its strength increasing with each passing week. It killed one of its nurses in a fit of rage, tearing her apart with its bare hands and horns, and then devoured her flesh. It became clear that the Minotaur was not a child who might be taught gentleness or reason. It was a monster, pure and simple, driven by instincts that were alien and terrible. King Minos faced an impossible situation. This thing was born of his wife's body, carried his blood, however tainted. He could not bring himself to order its death. What would that say about his household, his lineage, his ability to control even his own family? But neither could he allow it to roam free, killing servants and spreading terror through the palace. The creature needed to be contained, hidden away where no one would know of the shame that had befallen the house of Minos. The king summoned Daedalus and gave him a commission unlike any other. Build me a prison from which nothing can escape. Make it vast, make it complex, make it so intricate that even the gods would lose their way inside it. The monster must be contained, but it must also be hidden, not just locked away, but lost, buried so deep in confusion that even its cries cannot find their way to the outside world. And so Daedalus set to work on his masterpiece, the creation that would define his legacy more than any other, the labyrinth. He designed it over months of sleepless nights, his mind working through problems of architecture and psychology, structure and disorientation. The labyrinth would not simply be a large building with many rooms. It would be a three-dimensional puzzle, a trap for the mind as much as the body. He built it near the palace at Knossos, excavating deep into the earth, using the natural limestone caves as a foundation and expanding outward and downward. The corridors twisted and doubled back on themselves. Staircases led up and down in ways that defied intuition. Rooms repeated with slight variations, so travelers thought they had been there before, but couldn't be certain. The walls were covered in frescoes, bulls and dancers, octopi and dolphins, that seemed to shift in the torchlight, making it impossible to use them as landmarks. False exits led to dead ends. Real exits were hidden behind seemingly solid walls. It took years to complete, and when it was done, even Daedalus could barely navigate it. He drew maps, but the maps were nearly incomprehensible, lines spiraling inward to a center that seemed to exist in multiple places at once. Workers who helped build it spoke of getting lost in sections they themselves had constructed, of feeling the weight of the earth above them pressing down, of hearing echoes that seemed to come from every direction and no direction at all. At the heart of this impossible maze, they placed the Minotaur. The creature fought and bellowed as they drove it deeper into the labyrinth. But eventually it found itself in the central chamber, a space vast enough for it to move, but from which there was no escape. The Minotaur would live there in darkness, fed through careful systems that allowed food to be delivered without anyone having to encounter the beast directly. But the Minotaur's hunger was vast and specific. It craved human flesh, and nothing else would fully satisfy it. This presented a problem that required a solution both practical and political. Minos, in his rage and grief over these events, looked for someone to blame beyond his own prideful mistake. His eyes turned toward Athens. Years before, Minos' son Androgeos had visited Athens during their games. He was a fine young man, athletic and skilled, and he bested all the Athenian champions in the competitions. But some in Athens, jealous of being surpassed, or simply cruel in the way crowds can sometimes be, had murdered the prince afterward, either in a direct attack or by sending him against the impossible bull of Marathon, knowing he would be killed. Minos had never fully avenged his son's death. Now, with the Minotaur requiring sustenance and Athens vulnerable to Crete's superior navy, the king saw an opportunity to combine vengeance with necessity. He sailed to Athens with his fleet and laid siege to the city. The Athenians, unable to match Crete's naval power and suffering from plague and famine that some said the gods sent in anger over Androgeos' death, sued for peace. Minos' terms were specific and terrible. Every 9 years, Athens must send a tribute of 7 young men and 7 maidens, chosen by lot from the finest families. These 14 youths would be sent to Crete, where they would be released into the labyrinth to feed the Minotaur. None would return. None would escape. Their deaths would pay the blood price for Androgeos, again and again, for as long as Athens existed under Crete's shadow. Athens, defeated and desperate, accepted these terrible terms, and so the cycle began. Every 9 years, parents would weep as lots were drawn, families would be torn apart, and ships with black sails would carry Athens' children across the sea to certain death. Twice, this tribute was paid. 28 young people entered the labyrinth and never emerged, their screams absorbed by the twisting corridors, their blood staining the ancient stones. Daedalus, knowing what his creation had become, lived with this knowledge like a weight on his soul. He was complicit in their deaths, not their killer, but the architect of the mechanism that made their killing possible. He threw himself into other work, trying not to think about the labyrinth, trying to ignore the ceremonies when new victims were delivered to the monster he had helped create. Icarus, growing into young manhood, understood that his father was haunted by something, but didn't fully comprehend what. The boy saw the sadness that sometimes overtook Daedalus, the way his father would stare at nothing for long moments. But youth cannot truly fathom the weight of such guilt. Icarus knew of the labyrinth. Everyone in Crete knew of it. But he thought of it as just another of his father's magnificent creations, not understanding the human cost it extracted. The 3rd tribute year arrived, and with it came change. Among the 14 Athenian youths who stepped off the ship with black sails was a young man different from the others. While his companions wept or stared in numb horror at the fate awaiting them, this youth stood tall, his jaw set with determination, his eyes scanning the palace and the gathered Cretans with the gaze of someone planning rather than surrendering. His name was Theseus, and he was a prince of Athens, son of King Aegeus, or perhaps, as some whispered, son of Poseidon himself, conceived when the god visited Aegeus's wife in disguise. Theseus had volunteered to be among the tribute, determined to end the cycle of sacrifice once and for all. He would enter the labyrinth, he vowed, and he would slay the Minotaur or die trying. Better one heroic death than the slow grinding of Athens beneath Minos' heel, year after year after year. The young women of Crete watched the Athenian youths process through the palace with mixed emotions, pity for their fate, pride in Crete's power, fascination with these strangers from across the sea. But one young woman felt something more. Princess Ariadne, eldest daughter of Minos and Pasiphae, saw Theseus and felt her heart stop and restart with painful intensity. She had grown up knowing about the Minotaur, her half-brother, though no one spoke of him as such. She had grown up with the knowledge that her mother's shame and her father's pride had created something monstrous, and that young people died because of it. The guilt had never fully been hers to carry, yet she felt it anyway, the way children feel responsible for their parents' sins, even when logic says they shouldn't. And now, Here was this young man who looked at the palace not with fear, but with defiance, who carried himself like someone who might actually accomplish the impossible. Love struck Ariadne like lightning from a clear sky. Instant, consuming, absolute. She did not choose it. It chose her. And with that love came a decision that would betray her father, her family, her entire kingdom. She waited until darkness fell, until the palace slept, and then she made her way through corridors she had known since childhood to a place she had never before dared to visit. Daedalus's workshop. The craftsman worked late, as he always did, bent over drawings by lamplight. When Ariadne entered, he looked up with surprise that quickly became understanding. He had seen this look before, in other contexts, the look of someone about to ask for something they knew was wrong, but felt compelled to request anyway. "You know why I've come," Ariadne said. It was not a question. Daedalus set down his stylus and looked at this young woman who carried her mother's beauty and her father's bearing. He thought of all the deaths his labyrinth had caused, all the young lives extinguished in its darkness. He thought of Talos, of choices made in moments of weakness that echo across years. He was old now, tired, worn down by the weight of his own genius. "The Athenian prince," he said softly. "You want him to survive." "I love him," Ariadne replied simply, and in those 3 words was all the certainty and foolishness of youth, all the bravery and recklessness that love can inspire. "Your father will never forgive you if you help him escape. You'll lose everything. Your position, your family, your home." "I know." Daedalus studied her face and saw that she did know, that she had counted the cost and chosen love anyway. Perhaps he envied her that clarity, that certainty. Perhaps he simply pitied her. Or perhaps, and this may have mattered most, he was tired of being complicit in death, tired of his genius being used to cause suffering rather than prevent it. "The labyrinth is designed so that no one can navigate it," he said slowly. "The passages twist back on themselves. The chambers repeat. Even if your prince defeats the Minotaur, he'll wander until he dies of thirst or madness. Then there must be a way to mark the path, something to show the way back." "There is," Daedalus admitted. He reached into a basket near his workbench and withdrew a ball of thread. Simple, undyed linen thread such as servants used for mending. "The solution is almost insultingly simple. Tie one end at the entrance. Unwind it as you go deeper. Follow it back to return. The labyrinth defeats complex thinking, so simplicity is the only answer." He placed the ball of thread in Ariadne's hands, his old fingers closing her young ones around it. "I've been waiting years for someone to ask for this," he confessed, hoping someone would have the courage to end what I created. "Give it to your prince. Tell him to keep his left hand on the wall and follow it inward to the center. The Minotaur sleeps during the day but hunts at night. So go in at dawn and tell him." Daedalus paused, his voice catching slightly. "Tell him I'm sorry for what I built. Tell him to make it right." Ariadne pressed the thread to her chest, like a precious treasure, and fled back through the darkened palace. She found Theseus where the tributes were being held, and through whispers and gestures, she gave him the thread and her heart in the same breath. Theseus, seeing her beauty and her courage, fell in love as quickly as she had. Or perhaps he simply recognized an opportunity and was wise enough to accept it. Either way, He took the thread and promised that if he survived, he would take her with him back to Athens, make her his wife, give her a life beyond her father's palace. Dawn came, pink and gold across the Cretan sky. The 14 Athenian youths were led to the labyrinth's entrance, a massive door in the side of a hill, carved with images of bulls and spirals that made the eyes ache to follow them. The door opened onto darkness absolute, and the youths were pushed inside, their cries echoing back as the door ground shut behind them. But Theseus had Ariadne's thread. He tied one end firmly to an iron ring near the entrance, then began unwinding the ball as he led the other tributes deeper into the maze. They followed him because he moved with confidence, because someone had to lead, and he seemed willing. The corridors twisted and turned. Stairs led down into earth that smelled of dampness and ancient stone, and everywhere were the bones of previous victims, white, gleaming in the torchlight. They heard the Minotaur before they saw it, a bellowing that was neither fully human nor fully animal, a sound that spoke of hunger and rage and madness. It charged from a side passage, immense and terrible, its bull's head massive with horns like spears, its man's body corded with muscle and covered with coarse hair. The other tributes screamed and fled, but Theseus stood his ground. The fight was brutal and brief. Theseus had brought no weapon. The Cretans had made certain of that. So he fought with his hands and his wits. He dodged the first charge, grabbed one of the Minotaur's horns as it passed, and held on as the creature bucked and thrashed. The beast's own momentum became its enemy. Theseus twisted, braced himself, and with all his strength, he broke the Minotaur's neck. The creature fell with a crash that echoed through the labyrinth like thunder in stone. It twitched once, twice, and then lay still. The monster that had devoured 28 Athenian youths, that had been the dark center of Crete's power and shame, was dead. Theseus gathered the other tributes, all still alive, all in shock at witnessing the impossible. He followed the thread back through the maze, walking the path in reverse, unwinding the mystery Daedalus's genius had created. The journey out took hours, but eventually they emerged into daylight that seemed impossibly bright after the labyrinth's darkness. Ariadne waited at the entrance, and when she saw Theseus alive, her relief and joy were so powerful she nearly fainted. But there was no time for celebration. They had to flee before Minos discovered what had happened. Theseus and Ariadne led the rescued tributes to the ship with black sails, and they fled into the night while the palace slept, sailing toward Athens and freedom while stars wheeled overhead. Morning brought revelation. Servants found the labyrinth's door ajar, the Minotaur dead in its center, the Athenian tributes gone. Someone had betrayed the king. Someone had given the secret away. And when it was discovered that Ariadne too was missing, that the princess had fled on the Athenian ship, Minos understood everything. His rage was absolute. He had lost his daughter to the enemy. His carefully constructed vengeance against Athens had been undone. The monster he had hidden to avoid shame was now known to be dead. Soon all the world would know of his family's disgrace, and someone had betrayed him, someone with knowledge of the labyrinth's secret. There was only one person in all of Crete who knew that secret: Daedalus. Soldiers came to the workshop at midday, armed and grim-faced. They seized Daedalus without explanation, his protests falling on deaf ears. They dragged him through the palace to Minos's throne room. where the king sat with a face like carved stone, barely containing volcanic fury. "You gave her the secret," Minos said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You, whom I trusted above all others. You, whom I saved from exile. You, to whom I gave wealth and position and protection. You betrayed me." Daedalus could have lied, could have claimed ignorance, but he was tired of lies. "She asked me how to save the young man she loved. I told her, I'm tired of my genius being used to cause death. I'm tired of building prisons and monsters. I don't regret it." "Don't regret it?" Minos's composure cracked, rage flowing through like molten stone through earth. "You will regret it. You will regret it every day for the rest of your life, however short that life may be." The king could have ordered Daedalus executed, but death would have been mercy, and Minos was not feeling merciful. Instead, he ordered something more poetic, more terrible. "Take him to the labyrinth," the king commanded. "Take his son as well. Let them both rot in the prison he created. Let the architect be trapped by his own design. Let him search forever for an exit he knows doesn't exist." Icarus was seized from the workshop, where he'd been waiting for his father's return. The youth struggled and shouted, but he was just one boy against trained soldiers. They dragged both father and son to the labyrinth's entrance and threw them inside, and the great door ground shut behind them, with a finality that echoed in Daedalus's bones. In the sudden darkness, broken only by the dim light filtering from vents high above, father and son stood together in the center of Daedalus's greatest creation, which had now become their tomb. The Minotaur's body lay somewhere in the darkness ahead, beginning to rot, but the maze itself remained as impenetrable as ever. Icarus, once his eyes adjusted, turned to his father with confusion and fear warring in his young face. "Father, what's happening? Why has the king done this? What have we done?" Daedalus placed his hands on his son's shoulders and felt how they trembled. With fear, yes, but also with cold, for the labyrinth was deep underground where no sun reached. "I've made mistakes," he said quietly. "Terrible mistakes. Some of them before you were born, some of them recently. And now we'll both pay for them. I'm sorry, Icarus. I'm so sorry." They explored the labyrinth as much as they could in the dim light, finding water that seeped from the stone walls, discovering that food was being lowered through shafts from above. Just enough to keep them alive, but not comfortable. Minos intended them to live in this prison, not to die quickly. Days blended into each other in the unchanging gloom. Icarus grew quiet and withdrawn, his natural cheerfulness dimming like a lamp running out of oil. Daedalus, however, did what he had always done when faced with impossible problems. He thought. He examined every corridor they could safely explore, studied every wall and passage, looked for weaknesses in his own design. And slowly, as days became weeks, an idea began to form. Not an escape through the labyrinth's passages, for those were truly impassable, but another way. A way he had never considered before because it had seemed impossible. But Daedalus was the master of making the impossible real. And if he was going to die in this place, he would at least die trying to save his son. The thought that had begun as the faintest whisper grew stronger, more defined, until he could see it clearly in his mind's eye. Wings. If Minos controlled the land and the sea, there remained one realm beyond his reach, the sky itself, and Daedalus, architect of the impossible, would learn to fly. In the labyrinth's oppressive darkness, where the weight of earth and stone pressed down from above, and the corridors twisted like a dying man's dreams, Daedalus made his decision. They would not escape through Minos' maze. They would escape above it. He began gathering materials with the systematic patience that had characterized all his work. The labyrinth had birds, pigeons and doves that nested in the upper reaches where light filtered through cunningly disguised vents, gulls that sometimes found their way inside and couldn't find their way out. These birds molted, and their feathers drifted down through the shafts to settle on the stone floors like small blessings from the world above. Daedalus and Icarus became hunters of these feathers, collecting every plume they could find. The long flight feathers that would provide structure and lift, the smaller contour feathers that would smooth airflow, even the soft down that would fill gaps and provide insulation. It was slow, painstaking work, made harder by the poor light and the need to explore the maze carefully, always leaving marks so they could find their way back to their central chamber. Icarus, at first confused by his father's obsession with bird feathers, gradually came to understand the plan. "We're going to fly?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder and disbelief. "Like birds? Like the gods?" "Like Daedalus and Icarus," his father corrected gently. "Not gods, just men who refused to accept their prison." As they collected feathers, Daedalus also gathered other materials, beeswax from hives that existed in the upper reaches. He smoked them out carefully, harvesting the golden combs and melting them into usable wax. Leather strips he cut from their own sandals and the garments they wore. Thread he unraveled from the fabric of their tunics. Wood he scavenged from old bones, yes, bones, of the Minotaur's previous victims, finding pieces that were straight and strong enough to serve as framework, carefully not thinking too hard about what they had once been part of. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. The work was intricate beyond measure, requiring all of Daedalus's skill and experience. He carved and shaped the wooden frames for 2 pairs of wings, designing them to distribute weight properly, to curve in ways that would catch air efficiently, to be light enough to lift a human body but strong enough not to break under the strain. He arranged the feathers in careful layers, smallest to largest, the way they grew on actual birds. He stitched them to the leather backing with thread, reinforced critical points with additional wrapping, sealed everything with melted wax that he smoothed with his thumbs until it gleamed gold in the dim light. The wax served double purpose, bonding the feathers in place and providing flexibility so the wings could move and adjust to air currents. Icarus watched his father work with fascinated attention. Sometimes he helped, holding pieces in place while Daedalus stitched or glued. Sometimes he just observed, noting how his father's hands never hesitated, how even after months in the labyrinth, those hands remained steady and certain. The boy found hope in his father's confidence, in the way Daedalus approached this impossible task, as if it were merely difficult rather than insane. "Will it work?" Icarus asked one evening, as they ate the meager meal that had been lowered through the feeding shaft. Daedalus considered the question carefully. "I don't know," he admitted. "No human has ever flown before. The gods gave birds hollow bones and natural wings. We have only wood and feathers and hope. But I've calculated the weight, the wing surface area, the probable lift. In theory, it should work. In practice, he shrugged. We'll discover that together. I'm not afraid, Icarus said, and he meant it. He was young enough that death seemed distant and abstract, young enough that the prospect of flight overshadowed any concerns about falling. His father's genius had always succeeded before. Why would this time be different? But Daedalus was afraid, terribly, constantly afraid. He was afraid the wings would fail, that they would fall and die on the rocks below. He was afraid that even if the wings worked, Minos would see them escaping and send ships to hunt them down wherever they landed. He was afraid that in his desperation to escape, he would kill his son just as he had killed his nephew. That history would repeat itself with terrible precision. Most of all, he was afraid that Icarus, who had never known freedom, who had spent crucial years of his youth locked in darkness, would feel the sky and lose all caution in the glory of it. When at last the wings were complete, two pairs that lay in their chamber like captured angels, gleaming with wax and promise, Daedalus knew the time had come. They had been imprisoned for nearly a year. Icarus had grown taller, leaner, his face losing the last softness of boyhood and taking on the harder angles of manhood. Daedalus himself felt older than his years, worn by guilt and fear and the constant darkness. He fitted the wings to Icarus's shoulders, attaching them carefully with leather straps that crossed the boy's chest and buckled at his waist. The wings were surprisingly light. Daedalus had designed them to be, carefully balancing strength against weight, but they felt substantial, real. Icarus stretched his arms experimentally, and the wings extended, feathers rustling with a sound like whispered prayers. Then Daedalus attached his own wings, working from practiced memory since he couldn't see his own back clearly in the dim light. When both were ready, he turned to his son with an expression so serious that Icarus's excited smile faded. "Listen to me, Icarus," Daedalus said, his voice carrying the weight of all his years and all his failures. "Listen carefully, because your life depends on understanding what I'm about to tell you." He placed his hands on the boy's shoulders, feeling the slight tremor of excitement running through his son's body. "You must fly the middle course. Do you understand? Not too low, not too high. The middle way." "Why?" Icarus asked, though his eyes were already drifting upward, toward the distant ceiling and the freedom beyond it. "If you fly too low, the sea's moisture will weigh down the feathers. They'll absorb water, become heavy, and you'll sink into the waves and drown. But if you fly too high..." Daedalus paused, making sure his son was truly listening. "If you fly too high, the sun's heat will melt the wax that holds the feathers together. The wings will fall apart, and you'll fall. I understand, Father. Do you? Do you truly?" Daedalus tightened his grip slightly. "The sky will be intoxicating, Icarus. You'll feel power you've never felt before. Freedom beyond anything you can imagine. Your instinct will be to soar higher, to see how far you can go, to test the limits of what's possible. But you must resist that instinct. You must follow my path exactly. Don't aim toward the constellations, not Botas the herdsman, not Helis the great bear, not Orion with his bright sword. Keep your eyes on me and fly the middle way. Promise me." "I promise, Father," Icarus said, and he meant it in that moment. He truly meant it. But Daedalus, who had lived longer and understood human nature better, knew how quickly promises could be forgotten when circumstances changed, how easily good intentions could dissolve in the heat of the moment. Still, what else could he do? They were already trapped. This was their only chance. He kissed his son's forehead, a gesture Icarus was almost too old for, but Daedalus needed to do it anyway, and tears, unexpected and unstoppable, rolled down his weathered cheeks. "I love you," he said simply. "Whatever happens, remember that I love you." "I love you too, Father," Icarus replied, puzzled by the intensity of emotion but moved by it nonetheless. They climbed together through the labyrinth's passages, moving upward, always upward, following shafts and corridors that led toward the surface. The climb took hours. The labyrinth was vast, and Daedalus had designed it to confuse in 3 dimensions as well as 2. But eventually they reached the highest point, where a large vent opened to the sky above, designed to allow air circulation through the maze. It was just barely large enough for a man to squeeze through. Daedalus went first, wriggling through the opening with difficulty, the wings on his back scraping against stone. Then he reached back to help pull Icarus up and out. They emerged on the hillside, above Knossos in the early morning, the sun just beginning to paint the eastern sky with rose and gold. Below them, the palace still slept, unaware that the prisoners were escaping, that the impossible was about to occur. The wind blew from the east, carrying the salt smell of the sea. Daedalus tested it with wet finger raised, calculating speed and direction. It was steady, good for flying, if anything about this could be called good. He looked at his son, at the wings rising from the boy's shoulders like something divine, at the excitement and trust shining in young eyes. "Stay close to me," Daedalus said. "Watch what I do and copy it. When I bank left, you bank left. When I adjust altitude, you adjust. Don't get creative. Don't experiment. Just follow." Icarus nodded eagerly, his whole body practically vibrating with anticipation. Daedalus took several steps back, calculating the running start he would need. Then, with a prayer to Athena on his lips and terror in his heart, he ran toward the cliff's edge and leapt into the void. For one awful moment, he fell. Gravity claimed him as it claimed all things, pulling him downward toward the rocks below. But then instinct took over. The instinct he'd built into the wing's design. The instinct he'd studied by watching birds for months. He extended his arms, caught the wind, adjusted the angle, and suddenly, miraculously, he was flying. The sensation was beyond anything he'd imagined. The wind held him, supported him, carried him forward. He flapped experimentally and rose slightly, banked right and felt himself turn, tilted his wings and descended a few feet. It worked. By all the gods, it actually worked. "Father." Icarus's voice came from behind and above. Daedalus looked back and saw his son airborne, wings spread wide, a smile of such pure joy on his face that it was almost painful to behold. "Stay with me," Daedalus shouted, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "Remember what I told you." They flew together over the sleeping palace, over fields where early rising farmers looked up in astonishment at the sight. A plowman paused mid-furrow, his jaw dropping as 2 figures with enormous wings passed overhead. A shepherd leaning on his staff forgot his flock entirely, staring upward with wonder. A fisherman checking his nets at dawn looked up and dropped his catch, certain he was witnessing gods. Who else could command the sky? And perhaps, for those few precious moments, that is what they were. Two humans had taken something reserved for birds and gods and made it their own through genius and desperation. They had escaped the inescapable, flown where humans were never meant to fly. The impossibility of it, the sheer audacious beauty of it, transformed them into something more than mortal. Below them, the island of Crete spread like a map drawn by the gods. They could see the palace at Knossos, smaller now, falling behind. They could see the harbors where Minos' ships lay at anchor. They could see the mountains that ran down Crete's spine, the valleys between, the olive groves and vineyards that made the island rich. And beyond, on all sides, the Aegean Sea spread blue and vast, glittering in the morning sun like hammered bronze studded with islands. Daedalus led them north and east, away from Crete, toward the chain of islands that would eventually lead to the Greek mainland. They passed sacred Samos, beloved of Hera, queen of gods. They saw Delos in the distance, where Apollo and Artemis had been born. They flew over Paros with its white marble cliffs, over Lebynthos where the honey was sweeter than anywhere else in the world. The wind was with them, and the flying, once the initial terror passed, became almost meditative. The steady rhythm of wings beating, the feel of air currents lifting and supporting, the vast view of earth and sea spreading below. It all combined to create a sense of peace Daedalus hadn't felt in years. They were doing it. They were escaping. His son was safe beside him, matching his every move, following instructions. Perhaps, he thought, perhaps we'll make it after all. But Icarus, flying just behind his father, was experiencing something different. Where Daedalus felt relief and cautious hope, Icarus felt exhilaration building toward something overwhelming. The boy had spent a year in darkness, a year of fear and cold and the oppressive weight of stone above. Before that, he'd spent his life on an island where his mother was a slave and his father's genius was owned by a king. He had never truly been free. And now he was flying, not walking, not even running, but flying like the birds he'd watched enviously all his life, flying like the gods he'd prayed to. The wind rushed past his face, singing a song of freedom and possibility. The sun warmed his back, and the sea below beckoned with its vast promises. Each beat of his wings sent him higher, and with each rise in altitude, his spirit soared higher still. He began to notice things his father had warned him about. Down there, close to the sea, he could see spray being thrown up by waves, moisture in the air, the thing his father said would weigh down the feathers. And up there, higher in the sky, the sun burned bright and hot, the heat that would melt the wax, his father had said. But the middle way, the safe path his father flew, suddenly seemed too cautious, too limited. They had escaped the labyrinth. They were flying, actually flying, doing what no human had ever done. Why should they fly low and careful, like frightened birds hugging the ground? Why not see how high they could go, how close to the gods they could rise? The thought grew in Icarus like a seed planted in fertile soil, sprouting and spreading with frightening speed. What if his father was wrong? What if the danger was exaggerated? Daedalus had been wrong before, wrong to trust Minos, wrong to build the labyrinth, wrong about so many things. Maybe he was wrong about this too. Maybe they could fly higher, could touch the realm of the gods, could become legends not just for escaping, but for soaring. Icarus, Daedalus called back. sensing something in the pattern of his son's wing beats, in the way the boy was drifting. "Stay with me. Remember what I said." "I'm fine, Father," Icarus called back, and his voice was bright with joy and something else. Something that made Daedalus's blood run cold, even as sweat from exertion dripped down his face. It started gradually. Icarus began flying a little higher, just a bit above his father's path. The view was better up there, he told himself. He could see farther, could spot any ships that might be pursuing them. It was practical, really, not reckless, just a little higher. But each time he rose a few feet, the next rise seemed equally justified. Each small transgression made the next one easier. The middle way his father insisted on seemed more and more like unnecessary caution, the worried boundaries set by old age and fear. Icarus was young, strong. His wings were sound. Why not test their limits? Why not see what was possible? Higher and higher he climbed, the angles of his wing beats growing steeper, his whole body tilting upward toward the sky, as if pulled by invisible strings. The sun, which had been a bright disk in the eastern sky, now seemed to fill his vision, to call to him with a voice made of light and heat. Helios, the sun god, drove his chariot across the heavens as he did every day, his immortal horses pulling the blazing wheel of fire that brought light and life to the world below. From his divine vantage point, he saw everything. The secret meetings of lovers, the crimes committed in supposedly hidden places, the pride and ambition of mortals who thought themselves exempt from the laws that governed all things. And now he saw Icarus, a young man wearing wings of feathers and wax, climbing higher into the sky, approaching the realm of the gods with the presumption of one who had forgotten, or never learned, the proper boundaries between mortal and divine. The sun's rays intensified. Perhaps the god willed it so. Perhaps it was simply that Icarus was now close enough, that the full force of the sun's heat reached him undiminished by distance, or the filtering effect of the lower atmosphere. The distinction didn't matter. Icarus felt the warmth on his back grow from pleasant to uncomfortable, from uncomfortable to alarming. The wax that bound his feathers, carefully melted and applied, smoothed and shaped by his father's expert hands, began to soften. It lost its solid structure, becoming tacky, then truly soft, then liquid. The first feather came loose and floated away, tumbling in the wind like snow in reverse. Icarus barely noticed it. But then another fell, and another, and suddenly he understood with terrible clarity that his father had been right, that the warnings hadn't been excessive caution, but precise truth, that he had made a catastrophic mistake. He flapped his wings desperately, frantically, but with each beat, more feathers fell away. The wax ran down his arms in golden rivulets that looked almost beautiful in the sunlight, like tears wept by something precious and doomed. The wings, so carefully constructed, so lovingly designed, were dissolving around him, leaving only bare wooden frames and his naked arms beating uselessly against air that no longer supported him. "Father," the word tore from his throat, part scream, part sob, all terror. "Father, help me." Daedalus, flying below and ahead, heard that terrible cry and felt his heart stop. He banked sharply, turning back, and saw what he had feared from the moment they first took flight. His son falling, the wings disintegrating, feathers scattered across the sky like a trail of sorrow and broken promises. "Icarus!" Daedalus screamed, diving toward his falling son, knowing even as he did that there was no way to catch him, no way to save him, that physics and distance and the speed of falling made rescue impossible. Icarus! For a moment, impossibly, their eyes met. Father and son, one rising desperately to meet the other, one falling inexorably toward the sea. In Icarus's eyes, Daedalus saw terror, yes, but also something else. Regret, understanding, an apology for not listening, for thinking himself wiser than wisdom, stronger than fate. Then Icarus hit the water with a splash that looked, from Daedalus's height, no larger than a stone dropped from a child's hand. The sea, which had sparkled so beautifully in the morning sun, now swallowed the boy without ceremony or mercy. Feathers continued to rain down around the spot where he'd vanished, settling on the waves like white flowers thrown on a grave. Daedalus circled, descended, his wings carrying him lower toward the water. He called his son's name again and again, his voice breaking, hoping beyond hope that Icarus would surface, would be swimming, would be alive despite the impossible height from which he'd fallen. But the sea kept its secrets. The boy who had flown too close to the sun had been claimed by the water, his body carried down into depths where light didn't reach, where the weight of water was like the weight of earth in the labyrinth, absolute, inescapable, final. Daedalus landed on a small island nearby, barely more than a rocky outcropping in the sea. He tore off his wings with shaking hands and dove into the water, swimming out to where the feathers still floated. He dove beneath the surface again and again, searching, hoping, refusing to accept what he knew in his heart to be true. But the sea was deep there, and Icarus was gone. Finally, exhausted and half-drowned himself, Daedalus dragged himself back to the island. In the shallows, tangled in kelp, he found his son's body. He pulled Icarus from the water and carried him to the rocky shore, and there he knelt, holding the boy who would never laugh again, never ask questions, never grow into the man he was meant to become. Daedalus wept then, as he had never wept before. Not when he'd murdered Talos, not when he'd been exiled from Athens, not during all the months in the labyrinth. He wept for his son, yes, but also for himself, for the curse that seemed to follow his genius, for the way his greatest creations brought only death to those he loved. He had made wings to save his son, and instead had given him the means of his destruction. He had warned him, true, but he had also known in his bones, that young men don't listen to warnings, that youth believes itself immortal, that Icarus would do exactly what he did. And yet he had given him wings anyway. What did that make him? Hero or murderer? Loving father or reckless fool? For hours Daedalus sat on that barren rock with his son's body, unable to move, unable to think beyond the vast emptiness that had opened inside him. Eventually, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Helios completing his daily journey, indifferent to the grief of one old man, Daedalus stirred. He found a spot on the island where the earth was soft enough to dig, and there, with his bare hands, he buried his son. He placed rocks over the grave to protect it from scavengers, arranged them carefully in a pattern that would endure, and he named the island Icaria, so that all who passed this way would know that here lay a boy who had flown, however briefly, however tragically. The sea around it he called the Icarian Sea, transforming the waters that had claimed his son into an eternal memorial. The work of burying Icarus took until nightfall. When it was done, Daedalus sat by the grave and spoke to the stone that covered his son. He told Icarus he was sorry for giving him wings, sorry for not understanding that warnings aren't enough, sorry for every choice that had led to this moment. He spoke until his voice gave out, until the stars emerged overhead in their countless thousands, spinning slowly around the pole as they had since the beginning of time and would until the end. In the morning, Daedalus put on his wings once more. They felt heavier now, as if they absorbed his grief and carried it along with his body. He flew west and north, away from Icaria, towards Sicily, a large island west of Greece where he hoped to find sanctuary beyond Minos's reach. The journey took days. He flew during daylight, resting on islands at night, eating what little food he could scavenge or beg from frightened villagers who thought him a god or demon. The joy of flight was gone, replaced by numb necessity. The wings that had represented freedom and genius now felt like instruments of torture, but they were his only means of escape. Sicily, when he finally reached it, was green and mountainous, rich with grain fields and vineyards. King Cocalus ruled there, a gentler monarch than Minos, known for his love of arts and learning. When a man with great wings landed near his palace, Cocalus received him with curiosity rather than fear. Daedalus told his story, some of it anyway. Enough that Cocalus understood he was fleeing Minos's wrath, that he possessed great skill as a craftsman and architect, that he sought only peace and the chance to work. Cocalus, perhaps moved by the deep sadness he saw in the old man's eyes, perhaps simply wanting to employ such genius, offered sanctuary. Daedalus accepted. He went to the temple of Apollo who drove his sun chariot each day with more care than Helios, Apollo who was patron of arts and civilization, and there he hung up his wings as an offering. The great feathered constructions, stained with salt and grief, hung in the temple, where all could see them and know that a man had once flown, that genius could achieve the impossible, and that the impossible often carried a terrible price. Daedalus vowed never to fly again. He vowed to use his remaining years to create beauty rather than prisons, to design temples and irrigation systems and works of art that would help rather than harm. He tried to atone, though he knew that no amount of good work could erase what he had done, could bring back Talos or Icarus, or undo any of his mistakes. King Cocalus's daughters grew fond of the sad old craftsmen who worked in their father's service. He made them beautiful things, jewelry boxes carved with incredible detail, mirrors framed in silver, mechanical toys that moved and sang. They protected him, these young women, treated him with a kindness he no longer felt he deserved. Years passed. Daedalus grew old in Sicily, his hands still steady, but his eyes growing dim, his back bending under the weight of all he had built and destroyed. He lived long enough to hear that Minos had come searching for him, still seeking vengeance, still unable to forgive the betrayal. The story says that Minos traveled from court to court, carrying a spiral seashell, offering a reward to anyone who could pass a thread through its winding chambers. It was a test, for Minos knew that only Daedalus could solve such a puzzle. And indeed, when Cocalus brought the challenge to his craftsmen, Daedalus solved it easily. He tied the thread to an ant and let the insect walk through the shell's spirals. emerging at the other end with the thread behind it. Cocculus, realizing that Minos now knew where Daedalus was hiding, invited the Cretan king to a feast. But Cocculus's daughters, who loved the old craftsman who had made them such beautiful things, decided to protect him. While Minos bathed before dinner, they poured boiling water through pipes into the bath, scalding the tyrant to death. Thus ended Minos, drowned not in sea or labyrinth, but in bath water made deadly by the cleverness of women and the designs of the man he'd hunted. Some say it was justice. Some say it was murder. Daedalus, when he heard, felt nothing, not satisfaction, not grief, just a dull acknowledgement that another chapter of his long, tragic story had closed. He outlived Minos by some years, working until his hands finally failed him, until his eyes could no longer see the fine details that had once come so easily. He died in Sicily, an old man far from home, his genius remembered but his grief eternal. The poets say that in the years after his death, a strange thing happened on the island of Icaria. A partridge, a bird that flies low to the ground, a bird that builds its nests in bushes rather than trees, sometimes perches on the rocks near Icarus's grave. It sits there at sunrise and sunset, and it makes a sound that's neither quite a call nor quite a song, something that might be laughter, or might be weeping, or might be both at once. It's said to be the spirit of Talos, still inhabiting the form Athena gave him when he fell from the Acropolis all those years ago. The partridge, alone among all creatures, neither mourns nor honors Icarus. It simply watches and remembers and makes its strange, ambiguous sound. Because the partridge knows what we all must eventually learn, that what flies high must someday fall, that genius without wisdom leads to tragedy, that the middle way exists not to limit us, but to preserve us, and that the greatest heights are often just the longest distance to fall. The myth of Daedalus and Icarus has echoed across centuries because it speaks to something fundamental in human nature. We are creatures who dream of flying, who push against our limitations, who create marvels and horrors with equal facility. We are capable of both great genius and terrible mistakes, often simultaneously. Daedalus's story reminds us that our creations shape us as much as we shape them, that the labyrinth we build may become our prison, that the wings we craft for freedom may carry us to destruction. Icarus's story speaks to the eternal tension between caution and ambition, between youth's confidence and age's wisdom, between the thrilling heights we long to reach and the safe ground we're counseled to keep. The middle way that Daedalus advocated, not too high, not too low, is not cowardice, but wisdom. It's the recognition that we can achieve extraordinary things without overreaching, that we can fly without presuming to be gods, that acknowledging our limits is not weakness, but the foundation for genuine strength. And yet the story doesn't simply condemn Icarus's flight. There's something magnificent in his upward climb, something beautiful in his refusal to accept the boundaries set for him. He flew, however briefly. He touched heights no human had reached before. His death was tragic, yes, but his life, in those final moments, was glorious. Perhaps that's the deepest wisdom the myth offers, that being human means living in the tension between earth and sky, between mortal limitation and divine aspiration, between the safety of the known and the danger of the unknown. We must attempt the impossible while respecting its dangers. Reach for the sun while remembering our wings are made of wax. Honor both Daedalus's warnings and Icarus's courage. The feathers still fall in stories and imagination, white against the blue sky, marking the place where a boy once flew. And we who hear the tale are left to ponder which matters more, the soaring or the falling, the attempt or the failure, the brief flight or the eternal memorial. Perhaps the answer is that they're inseparable, that you cannot have one without the other, that every true flight carries within it the possibility of falling, and every fall is made meaningful by the height from which we descended. So, sleep now, with thoughts of sky and sea, of fathers and sons, of wings that carried dreams and warnings across the wine-dark water. Sleep and remember that we are all, in our way, both Daedalus and Icarus, crafting our own wings, hearing wisdom we may or may not heed, flying toward our own sun, hoping the wax will hold just long enough to reach where we're going. The story ends, as all stories must, but its truth endures, passed down through centuries, whispered from age to age. Fly if you must, but remember the middle way. Reach for the heights, but respect their dangers. And if you fall, when you fall, may your landing be soft, your memorial kind, and your attempt remembered not as foolishness, but as the eternal human longing to rise above what we were born to be. To soar beyond our limits, to fly, if only for a moment, like the gods.